All right. Section 4, we're going to look at codes and cultures. So codes, they're basically the rules that we have, and we're going to look at the rules we have for language, whether it's written or spoken language, and the rules that we have for how we interact with each other non-verbally. Okay. Chapter 6 is all about language. Chapter 7 is all about nonverbals. So we will dive into these topics in much more depth later in the semester. Okay, so let's look at verbal codes. There are a lot of similarities amongst all the languages. I mean, basically we use our language to communicate, but there are quite a few differences. So language and identity. So when some members of a society speak a dominant language and others speak a minority language, what happens then? Well, obviously speakers who have the non-dominant language feel pressured to fit in and speak the language. This is a little bit off topic, but also on topic. So my mother's parents are, my grandmother was actually born in Italy. My grandfather his parents were born in Italy, and he was born soon after they came to the United States. And when my mother was a little girl, her nonna, her grandmother, lived with them. And she remembers that when her grandmother left to live with one of her other daughters, my mother said to her mother, "Do we still have to speak Italian now that Nonna doesn't live here?" Because she just wanted to be like the other kids in her neighborhood. And now, she really regrets that. And so she's been doing, was it Duolingua, so that she can learn her Italian again. So anyways, language and self-concept are very closely tied. So your language and your identity are, it's sometimes hard to separate the two. And so obviously we all feel most comfortable when we are speaking our native language and when we are speaking with people from who speak our native language. If you remember the Stewie Griffin model, where we looked at the environment. So when you are speaking your own language and you're speaking to someone who also speaks that language, there's a lot more overlap than when you're speaking to, the environment. There's an overlap of environment. And there was another point that I was going to make, and it just went out. Okay, so when you ask an American, "What's your name?" we always start with our first name. But when you ask people from other cultures, like they said, if you ask a Hindu, they may well give you their caste and village and then their names, and Sanskrit will begin with their lineage. Okay, those are cultures that are much more collectivistic. So that's definitely, that's kind of a part of how we see ourselves. There are also verbal communication styles. We will look at the big three. All right, direct and indirect. This is very much the low context and high context. Are we going to use language to express our thoughts and feelings directly, or are we going to be more indirect and use language less to get our point across and more to maintain social harmony? That would be indirect. So you can start to imagine, as I talked about earlier, when you have people who have a different verbal communication style communicating with each other, there is room for miscommunication. Another verbal communication style, we can speak elaborately or succinctly. Americans tend to be more succinct. Arabs tend to be a little bit more elaborate. So if you're at someone's, so this, I mean, it's culture, it's also language. I remember I have a background in English as a second language, and I remember one of the professors saying to us, you know, in Arabic, they really value a style that is much more elaborate, more flowery. People from the United States would think it's kind of overblown. Whereas if it's an American who's, you know, learning Arabic and writing, they would write more succinctly and they might be seen as being a little more childlike and too basic in their writing. Is one better than the other? No, they're just different. And so you need to realize that possibly if there's someone who seems to be going on, not the way I do, we're trying to put in too many details because I don't know how to tell a succinct story, but just because that's the style that they grew up with, you know, we'll talk about this when we get to the last section. You know, what are you going to do? Are you going to tell them that their style of their verbal communication style is out of sync with how people do it in wherever you are, or do you just say, okay, this is different, and people communicate differently? All right, the third form of a different verbal communication style has to do with formal and informal. So Americans tend to be very informal. I loved this, where there was a guidebook for British readers who are possibly thinking of a trip to the U.S. Visitors may be overwhelmed by the sheer exuberant friendliness of Americans, especially in central and southern parts of the country. So obviously those of us in New England, we're not that friendly. Sit next to an American on an airplane and he will immediately address you by your first name and ask, so, how do you like it in the States? Explain his recent divorce in intimate detail, invite you home for dinner, offer to lend you money, and wrap you in a warm hug on parting. This does not necessarily mean he will remember your name the next day. Americans are friendly because they just can't help it. They like to be neighborly and want to be liked. Okay, so a very informal style. You know, we do have a more of a tendency to call people by their first names. You know, people will say, oh, I don't know, like, you know, Dr. Addie, can I call you Catherine? So, which makes me think our former president of Tunxus, Dr. Catherine Addie, you know, she was the boss of my boss. A very, very friendly, open, lovely person. And she would say, you know, she encouraged all of us to address her by her first name. And I was like, I'm going to do this. And I would go up and I'd say, you know, hello, Dr. Addie. I couldn't do it. And then after a couple of years, I remember at one point we were talking and I said, you know, so Catherine, blah, blah, blah. And a little while later, I said, did you notice I addressed you by your first name? And she said, yes, and I'm so proud of you. So, yes, overall, I am more informal in my speaking, but I still have this feeling that I encourage people to be informal with me, but people who have a higher status than I do, like the college president, I would find it a little bit difficult to be that informal. Okay, there is a concept that you probably all do, but you are unaware of it. It is called code switching, where you, in one situation, you use a certain verbal code, and in another situation, you use a different verbal code. Generally, in the classroom, I am a little bit more formal than I would be when I'm talking with friends. I tend not to use a lot of profanity, but I would definitely, if I'm going to use it, I would use it with friends as opposed to using it in the classroom. And if I do use it in the classroom, I always preface it with, I'm going to say something that's, you know, that's a little bit off color, or that's, you know, not socially acceptable. So I have a friend and colleague. He is Black. He lives in the city, and he code switches like nobody's business. He can put on the very formal, I am a professor, and you know, he listening to him, he just fits right in. And then I've been in a classroom with him when he's decided he really needs to relate, especially to the younger students, the younger males. and he starts using words that I don't even know, and I realize I do not have that ability, because that is not one of the codes that I can follow. So there's nothing right or wrong about a verbal code. It's definitely situational. And as I've said a couple times, when we'll get to the last section, we're going to talk about when do you use it. You're trying to be appropriate. You're trying to be effective. And so you get to choose which of the verbal codes you're going to use in the situation. The other idea are nonverbal codes. And again, this is chapter 7. I said this kind of earlier. Humans share many elements. If you see someone crying, it means they are sad. And as the textbook says, they can be faking it, they can be using it for an effect, but it is to show them that they are sad. As far as we know, there is no culture that uses that where people crying indicates they are happy. Okay, so, but there's such differences in nonverbal behaviors. They use the example of the okay sign, which in the United States means, okay, it's great. In France and Belgium, it means you're worth 0. In Japan, that means money. In Greece and Turkey, it's an insulting or vulgar sexual invitation. So in Niger, where I lived for many years, when you do the number 5, in the United States, if you want to say 5, you say to a kid, how old are you? And they say 5, they will do 5, an open hand flash towards you. Well, in Niger, that open hand towards somebody is like giving someone the finger. So what you do is you put all of the fingers together and say 5. So, you can unintentionally insult someone by not knowing the nonverbal codes. A big one also is distance. How close do we stand to people? That's a nonverbal code. And also eye contact. Whoa, almost knocked over my water bottle. When we get to chapter 7, we'll talk a lot about this. So the last topic, okay, I forgot I had this slide. What do you think? Code switching does not require rejecting one's heritage, but is rather considered a bilingual ability. I just think that's when I talked a little bit earlier about first generation college students and coming home and talking differently, and then the family may be saying, oh, you're putting on airs, you're trying to be somebody that you're not. Well, this idea of code switching, when you're using a different language, that sometimes people feel you're doing it because you are trying to be above other people. Okay, so microaggressions. Frequently, this is a topic that's becoming more widely talked about, more widely thought about these days. Frequently, it's racial discrimination. It could be sexual orientation discrimination. It could be gender discrimination. Okay. Somebody says, oh, I didn't know your people acted that way. Or I don't know if we call a difficult test gay, where people will say, oh, that's so gay. What exactly does that mean? Okay. And as the textbook says, it really says more about the person who is doing the microaggression or the snubber than the person that they're trying to snub. It does not have to be verbal. It can be nonverbal. There's a video that I'm going to post the link to. It's called Microaggressions, and I'd like you to watch it and pay attention to the expression on people's faces, the nonverbal, the way that people are communicating nonverbally. So, a competent communicator is aware of their own, possibly even unintentional microaggressions. And, if somebody calls you out on it and says, you did, you rolled your eyes when I said this, you have to be open and say, wow, I wasn't aware of that. Now that I'm aware, I need to work on it. So that's why they say you need to be aware and accountable. Okay, In a little bit, I'm going to do the fifth and last section. And where is this thing? Okay, and stop.